Amen, 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 amen. Well, folks, James Baldwin said how American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. That line has been really sticking with me. And frankly, I can't stop thinking about it this past month or so. For each of these sermons, trying to figure out, where have I been? Where was I? What have I done? Good and bad, or indifferent? How do I share a message to a congregation that has hardly any people of color in it? And we've always said that there's not a lot of Jews of color in Boulder County, but I'm realizing that's not true. It's never been true. There's something else where we haven't communicated that this could be a safe place. We haven't always communicated that this is a safe place no matter what color we are. And I think if our congregation and its building and its programs or anything we do is worth its salt, it has to be a safe space. And it's only in these recent days, really, and I've shared this this past month, the past year and a half or so of real soul searching that led me to give a sermon even on Yom Kippur about these themes, these particular issues. And I recognize that it hasn't always been safe for everyone. So then naturally the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to learn about it? How come I never discovered this Juneteenth moment of marking history? What about these other questions that so many of us are asking? How come nobody told me about the Black Wall Street or other kinds of acts of terror? We kind of fooled ourselves that things are a lot better. And maybe they are. They are for Jews. But I think there's more. You know, this commemoration about the official ending of mass enslavement of African Americans, this Juneteenth, that's actually not what it's about. Doing a lot of reading this week, a lot of soul searching this week, I found some resources from the King Center that made it really very clear to me, the King Center in Atlanta, of course. And I learned that Juneteenth isn't the day that enslaved people were freed, or the day that slavery ended. It marks the day when enslaved Texans found out that they had been free for over 2 years. Juneteenth celebrated the end of slavery in the United States. On June 19, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and denounced the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery. However, the Emancipation Proclamation came 2.5 years earlier, January 1st, 1963. Many enslavers, a better word, don't you think? Many enslavers continue to hold enslaved people captive after the announcement. So Juneteenth became a symbolic date representing African American freedom. Attempts to explain this 2.5-year delay in the receipt of these important news have yielded several versions that have been handed down through the years, apparently. Often told is that there was a story of a messenger who was murdered on his way to Texas with the news of freedom. Could be. Another is that the news was deliberately withheld by the enslavers to maintain the labor force on the plantations. And still another is that federal troops actually waited for the enslavers to reap the benefits of one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. All of which, or none of these versions, could be true. Certainly for some, President Lincoln's authority over the rebellious states was in question. Whatever their reasons, conditions in Texas remained status quo well beyond what was statutory. So it's not simply that it ended slavery in America. It still wasn't told as a truth. And one reason or another, people still hurt. And when I was looking at this Juneteenth story, I started thinking so much more of our Exodus story, not to compare suffering, not to say whose was worse, but if Exodus and liberation is part of our memory, then I remembered. Albert Vorspan is this great, amazing, wonderful teacher of mine who is this social justice activist. And he, with another rabbi activist, Eugene Lippman, wrote a book in 1956 called Justice and Judaism, 1956. And they have in this section about civil rights, there's a whole chapter, and it was divided up, and one of the smaller little subgroups within the chapter said the role of the synagogue. The role of the synagogue in 1956, talking about civil rights. And the first thing that they wrote was this. They said self-understanding would be an excellent starting point in this area. And I almost wanted to weep. Self-understanding would be an excellent starting point in this area, so fraught with deep-seated, often irrational emotions. 1956, Al Vorspan and Gene Lippman said that line. I think, and I've been sharing, that it is time for us to get uncomfortable. I have two things I want to share with you. One is something I just discovered. My wife shared with me, because we were reading different books and talking about them, and she shared with me something she's reading by Austin Channing Brown. The book is called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in the World Made for Whiteness. The title alone stops me in my tracks. And this is what she says, and I want you to hear it and wait for it, because the second part of this, of what I'm about to share, I think is magnificent. She says, the moment Black Americans achieved freedom from enslavement, and that's what brought me to this part of the sermon, thinking of Juneteenth. The moment Black Americans achieved freedom from enslavement, America could have put to death the idea of Black inferiority. But whiteness was not prepared to sober up from the drunkenness of power over another people group. Whiteness was not ready to give up the ability to control, humiliate, or do violence to any Black body in the vicinity, all without consequence. Ultimately, the reason we have not yet told the truth about this history of Black and white America is that telling an ordered history of this nation would mean finally naming America's commitment to violent, abusive, exploitative, immoral white supremacy, which seeks the absolute control of Black bodies. It would mean doing something about it. How long will it be before we finally choose to connect all the dots? How long before we confess the history of racism embedded in our systems of housing, education, health, criminal justice, and more. How long before we dig to the root? Because it is the truth, she says, that will set us free. She writes a lot and speaks a lot, by the way, to people of faith, and particularly in church communities. So she wrote, sadly, too many of us in the church don't live like we believe this. We live as if we are afraid. Acknowledging the past will tighten the chains of injustice rather than break them. We live as if the ghosts of the past will snatch us if we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So instead, we walk around the valley, talk around the valley. We speak of the valley with cute euphemisms. In quotes, she writes, "We just have so many divisions in this country," close quotes. Another one could be, if we could just get better at diversity, we'd be so much better off. Her third euphemism is, we are experiencing some cultural changes. All euphemisms. And then she says, our only chance at dismantling racial justice is being more curious about its origins than we are worried about our comfort. It's not comfortable conversations for any of us. It's risky and messy. It is haunting work to recall the sins of our past, but is this not the work we have been called to anyway? Is this not the world of the Holy Spirit to illuminate truth and inspire transformation? It's haunting, but also holy. And when we talk about race today, with all the pain packed into that conversation, the Holy Spirit remains in the room. This doesn't mean the conversations aren't painful, that they aren't personal, aren't charged with emotion, but it does mean we can survive. We can survive honest discussions about slavery, about convict leasing, about stolen land, deportation, discrimination, and exclusion. We can identify the harmful politics of gerrymandering, voter suppression, criminal justice laws, and policies that are disproportionately affect people of color negatively. And we can expose the actions of white institutions, the history of segregation and white flight, the real impact of all, on all, white leadership. The real impact of all white leadership, the racial disparity in wages, and the opportunities for advancement. And she concludes, we can lament and mourn. We can be livid and enraged. We can be honest and we can tell the truth. We can trust that the Holy Spirit is here. We must, for only by being truthful about how we got here can we begin to imagine another way. And I found her writing to be beautiful and honest and real and uncomfortable and messy and fair, and really fair. So here's something else I want to leave you with on this Juneteenth that synagogues around the world are starting to acknowledge. Another activist, she's a Sikh American. Valerie Carr is a civil rights lawyer and a filmmaker. And this is what she shared. And this I need you to hang on to. The mother in me asks, what if? What if this darkness out in the world, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? God, I don't know of a more beautiful statement. A country that's not dead. It's not. But it is waiting to be born, or at the very least, reborn. And isn't that our story too? The Israelites going through the sea with water on each side, going through that dry ground that probably wasn't dry at all. It was probably filled with mud and muck. And they got their way through it, through that birth canal. We were birthed to liberation. It didn't just happen. It didn't just appear. God had to work really hard, I'm sure, to make everything happen the way it needed to. And after that moment, when people who were enslaved realized that they were free, but really weren't treated that way, the birth process wasn't over. So while I, and maybe some of you, feel a sense of darkness, I'm going to hang on to that hope. I am going to see the power and potential of a future, because I have never given these sermons before this year. My rabbis never gave this sermon. Nobody talked about this aspect of racism. I think a lot of you are sharing with me how much you really are learning, and so am I. How much we really are watching documentaries and understanding truths different than ever before. Thank God we can open our eyes, and it's going to be fraught and scary and messy, just like she said. But God's presence is here. And whoever does this work, God's presence is there. And no matter what happens, God's presence will still be there. And if God's name in Jewish tradition also is emet, truth, then let's be willing to unpack the truths for people of color, for Jews, to the rest of the world. We have truths to share to folks in the LGBTQ plus communities. They have truths to share. This is a time for some humility and to not always debate. Because for me, that interesting academic debate is somebody's lived experience. And the more I debate, the more I inadvertently hurt. And we have to stop doing that. So here's to new beginnings, friends. Birthing a new nation. Going through the mud and the muck of the sea towards a promised land. And just like the reading says, I really want to see that we get to do that. Hand in hand and marching together. I'm going to show you a slide. We share another melody, and then we move to conclude.
Let us take those words, that listening, that action, Aleinu.